Hi, this is Debbie, and today I have a review of some markers. Now these are new to the market and they are the Pigment markers from Winsor & Newton. Winsor & Newton are a UK company who have been around for almost 200 years producing quality art supplies. So I was automatically interested when I first started seeing the marketing for these new markers. However, it wasn't so much what the markers were themselves that first grabbed my attention, it was the design. I love the look of these markers. They're clean and simple, the beautiful white lines with the pops of colour, they really appeal to me. Now that the design and marketing team from Winsor & Newton had grabbed my attention, I was then keen to find out what these markers were. How were they different from the markers that I currently have? So let's take a closer look. These 5 colours along with the white blender come in the rich tone set, and I've also added in the Colorless Blender as well. As you will come to see, these markers are not like Copic markers. However, I've pulled out one of my Copics to compare for size and also to compare some of the differences between the markers. Comparing the two, the Winsor & Newton marker is slightly longer than a Copic and also slightly wider at its widest point. The design of the Copic barrel means that when you place it on your desk, it doesn't roll around. Now, as much as I love the design of the Winsor & Newton marker, the round barrel does mean that these guys will roll around on your desk. The markers are double-ended with only one end coated with a pigment colour. Let's take a closer look at the nibs. This is the triangular cap and that encases the fine nib. And I would describe this as a bullet nib. When closing the cap, you have to be careful because there's actually a little ridge inside. Now that's obviously what stops the nib from drying out, but you just have to make sure you line that up correctly and that you're not bumping the nib against the edge. The second nib is a chisel nib, and that is encased in a round-ended, colour-coded cap. And again, you've got to be careful of the ridge within inside the cap, that inner ridge, and make sure you don't bump your nib when you're closing the cap. The colours included in the ridge set are carmine, mauve, Winsor yellow deep, phthalo deep blue, emerald, the white blender, and I've also added in the colourless blender. In total, there are 100 colours in the range, including 24 greys. And the colour inside them, this is supposed to be, according to Winsor & Newton, the highest grade, light fast, fine art pigments instead of dyes. I think the idea is that rather than a marker, these are supposed to behave more like the paint that Winsor & Newton are renowned for. The markers are designed to work on the Winsor & Newton pigment marker paper. However, I wanted to test them on a range of card that I have. I've got some Copic Expressit, Simsys Stamp White, Basil Vellum, Simsys Stamp Black. I've got some of the Winsor & Newton pigment marker paper and also some Nina Solar White. I'm going to start with the Nina as I use this card a lot, and I'm going to lay down some of the Copic marker so that you can see the intensity of colour that you can get with the Copic marker, and then I'm going to put some of the pigment marker down from the Winsor & Newton carmine colour. Unlike my Copic marker, which was a little dry and could have perhaps done with a refill, the Winsor & Newton pigment marker is really juicy and is laying down a lot of colour, and it's very rich and vibrant. As far as show through is concerned, they're both about the same. Now, one of the things I'm really excited about is the white blender. I've not seen a white blender before. I don't think one exists, so I was really excited to see how this was going to work. However, I will say on the Nina, it didn't really work. It didn't really pick up any colour and blend. There was a small bit of transfer of colour, but it did actually peel the paper. Perhaps you can see there. I wanted to see if this was just the white blender or if it was also true of the other colours. So I've got 2 Copic marker colours and I'm just very quickly rubbing those over. I didn't really choose very good colours. I was trying to pick colours similar to that I had in the pigment marker. So I very quickly mixed a red and a yellow, and then I've got the carmine and I'm going to mix that with the Winsor Yellow Deep. And again, there isn't really any blending. You can see there's more blending with the Copic on the right than there is with the Winsor & Newton on the left. However, there wasn't any pilling when it was just with the markers rather than the blender. It was at this point that I thought I'd better investigate the Winsor & Newton pigment marker paper. The pigment markers are intended to be used on this paper, and therefore I thought that would probably give the better results and actually a better investigation of what they were actually like. I've quickly scribbled on some Copic markers again, and actually these Copic markers did go on really well on the pigment marker paper. So that's 2 on the left are Copics, and then I'm trying out the pigment markers now on the right, and they really did. That colour was really transferred from the carmine through the Winsor & Yellow Deep. You're getting lovely tones of orange in there, and then bringing over that white marker, and I really do like this white marker on this pigment marker paper. It is changing. It's creating different tones and different colours, and it moves so much. I should have zoomed out further. I zoomed in to see the pilling of the Nina paper, and I didn't zoom out when I was actually showing you this one. But the white marker, I could have carried on colouring with that for ages. It really did lift the colour. I'm now moving on to using the Colorless Blender, and this being transparent, it's lifting and moving those colours around, but it's not changing the tone. Unlike the white blender where you're getting that changing colour, say for example from the red through to the pink, with a Colorless Blender you're keeping the same colours. It was at this point that I got quite excited about how the pigment markers and the pigment marker paper were behaving together. You can actually move the marker with your finger. It sits on the surface of the paper and you're actually able to blend it. It's staying there, it's staying wet, and you're actually able to move it around with your finger. However, with Copic markers, once you've scribbled it on, the alcohol quickly evaporates and the colour is set, and it actually feels there's no movement and it feels tacky to the surface. So I will say that the pigment markers on the pigment marker paper, along with that white blender, I'm really excited about that I can see lots of different possibilities and lots of things that I'd like to investigate further. However, the Winsor & Newton pigment paper is only £20 in weight, and I'm used to something a little sturdier than that. So I'd like to investigate this paper further, and that may end up being the topic of another video review. Keeping in mind the way that these markers had worked on the pigment marker paper, I then turned to the Samsung Stamp White. Now this has got a slight sheen to it, so I thought that maybe it would work with the pigment markers, that they would move on that surface. However, there's a little bit of movement, but nowhere near as much as there was on the marker paper. And again, you're not really getting a lot of blending with the white blender, although it did pill less than it did on the Nina paper. With the Copic Express It, again, there was very little movement, very little blending, but again, it did stand up better than the Nina had to pilling. I think it comes down to the surface of the card. Nina cardstock is very absorbent and matte, and I think that isn't as able to stand up to the markers as much as the Copic and the Samsung Stamp are, which have a slight sheen to their surface. Keeping everything in mind that I was finding about these markers, I was very excited to see how they were going to work on vellum. With its non-porous surface, I was imagining that vellum was going to work really well with these markers, and it did. Straight away, you're getting that ability to move the marker around with your finger, and when bringing in the white blender, again, the colour is moving, you're getting that transfer of colour, and you're getting the different tones. I wanted to see how the white blender behaved on dark cardstock, and equally how the colours behaved on top of the white blender on dark cardstock. As a reference, I've written out hello in the Uniball Signo Broad white gel pen. That's a good gel pen for writing on dark colour cardstock, and then comparing that to the Winsor & Newton white blender. As you can see, with the white blender, you're really not getting the opaqueness that you can get with a white gel pen. However, on dark cardstock, the white blender does act as a really good base for bringing in the colour from the other pigment markers. So you can see how this Winsor Yellow Deep on the black cardstock without the white blender you can barely see at all, but on top of the white blender you're able to see the colours of the pigment markers. Here's a look at the colours that come in this rich tone set. This is on the pigment marker paper, and the colours, they really are so vibrant, they're so rich, they're really, really beautiful. So you've got mauve and then carmine, and this is the Winsor Yellow Deep, and then moving on to the emerald, and then it's going to be the phthalo deep blue, and then finally the white. And on the pigment marker paper you can't see the white, it is exactly the same tone as the pigment marker paper. Not forgetting that these pigments are light fast for 100 years, and you're going to be able to go back and look at your projects in the future and have confidence that they're still going to be as vibrant as they were the day you made them. So in summary, these markers are different to anything I've used before. They're very exciting, particularly that white blender and how that works with the pigment markers. They certainly work best on the pigment marker paper and on vellum, and I've also plans to see how they work with other marker papers and non-absorbent cardstock. And since I filmed this, I've carried on playing with these markers, and there's more interesting ways that I'd like to show you how to use them. So I'm planning on coming back with another video review soon. In the YouTube description below, you'll find links to the Winsor & Newton markers, as well as to my blog post at limedoodledesign.com. Thank you for joining me today, and if you'd like to see the next review on these markers, then please click subscribe.